because they may need more votes this time around.
All right, ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran. Always great to get your perspective, Terry. Thank you. And we have much more Election Day coverage ahead. And of course, the whole election could come down to must-win Pennsylvania, how voters there are feeling as they cast their votes. Stay with us.
Screening free everywhere.
Follow this version of me.
America's #1 most watched daytime talk show is ABC's The View.
You all heard it here first. I love it. I'm there for it.
Hot topics, political views.
That's what we're about.
Voices that matter. It all goes down right here.
That's why it's called the what? The View. I love it. I'm all in. Second that. This is going to be must-see TV, and so much could happen.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, you were looking at a polling location in Palm Beach, Florida. Polls there are open until 7 p.m. Eastern today. Meanwhile, Elon Musk can continue his controversial $1 million voter giveaway. A Philadelphia judge has ruled in his favor. The district attorney there had accused the billionaire Trump supporter of conducting an illegal lottery in Pennsylvania. Just one of the many stories that have raised concerns about election security and fairness throughout this campaign cycle. Let's bring in Andrew Garber, counsel with the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections program, for more. What do you make of this judge's decision and the controversy surrounding this case in general, Andrew?
Well, the judge's decision, we don't really know if this program is illegal or not. We didn't get any rationale for the decision in the moment. But what I'm really concerned about with this program is that it's continuing to drive an environment of distrust around our elections. It's sending a further signal to voters and people throughout the country that there's cause for concern. And in reality, these are just efforts to undermine our trust, give people reason to doubt the results, when in reality, we should be very confident in the safety and security of our elections. And we should be very confident in the work being done by election officials across the country to make sure the results are accurate.
So let's talk more about that, because Jen Easterly, the director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, told ABC News her quote was a fire hose of disinformation is targeting the integrity of our elections. So are elections secure, and how do we know that?
Our elections are very secure, and we know that because there are so many safeguards and guardrails in place to make sure that that is the case. Our election officials throughout the country do everything from all sorts of chain of custody rules to make sure the ballots, we always know where they are as they're being voted. We have poll watchers present both at polling places and at ballot counting sites that provide additional transparency. Almost every ballot now has a paper trail, which is great for auditing elections after the fact. Election officials do all sorts of processes between today and certification of elections to make sure the totals add up. So just step after step of the process, there are multiple systems in place to make sure the vote is accurate. And that's why we can be confident that in the end, it will be.
So what are your biggest concerns as far as election security goes?
Well, I think most voters are going to have very positive experiences today. They're going to see voting go off without a hitch, and they can be confident in the end results. Some of the big concerns I'm feeling, however, involve disinformation, involve efforts to undermine that confidence. And push people not to believe the results. That's something that's really harmful to our democracy when we see it happen across the country. Similarly, there will be some pockets today, most likely, where we see efforts to intimidate voters or harass poll workers and delay election proceedings. These kind of things happen. Tens of millions of people are going to cast ballots today at thousands and thousands of different polling places. And the good news is election officials have been preparing all year and really for years and years, election after election, to be prepared for those sorts of things. And so they'll be ready to respond when they pop up, and voters can go vote feeling confident and safe, knowing that they'll be able to participate in the process, in most cases with no issues, or in cases where issues pop up, that there's something that can be resolved.
All right, counsel with the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program, Andrew Garber. We appreciate it, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on.
And more than 80 million Americans have already cast their votes early. Millions more are heading to the polls today. ABC News legal contributor and trial attorney Brian Buckmeyer joins me now for more on what we should know about our rights as we head to the polls. So, Brian, there's a lot of misinformation out there about voting. So let's just break down the basics here. Who can vote, who cannot vote, and what should people know as they head to the polls?
So, Dan, who can vote is a simple list of United States citizens who are registered to vote above the age of 18. And depending on what state you're in, you can either not be serving or not convicted of a felony. There are certain ways that your voting right can be stripped away from you, like a felony conviction or being found incompetent by some sort of court or judge. And then, of course, people who cannot vote will be anyone else. And when we talk about voting, we're talking about the ability to legally vote.
So what if a poll worker says your name's not on the list of registered voters?
Yeah, so a number of things. Before you go to the polls, I would say to double check to make sure you're registered, make sure that all information is correct, your name, address, what county you're in. But if you do get to a point where a poll worker is saying you cannot vote, ask for what's called a provisional vote or provisional ballot. In New York, I think they call it an affidavit instead. That's a form of ballot that you can use to vote, and there will be an investigation following up to ensure that you're properly registered. And if you are, that vote will apply. If it's not, then the investigation will continue.
Brian, if you show up to your polling station right before it closes and there's a line, can you be turned away because you didn't actually make it into the polling station in time?
So we've seen some legislation and as well as, let's say some court cases where this has occurred. And if you are one of those groups of people that I said, U.S. citizen, registered, and all the proper criteria to ensure that you can vote, and you are asked to step out of the line, as an attorney, I would say politely ask that you have the ability to remain in line. Of course, if it's an issue of timing or whatever their excuse can be, still try to stay in line. If it gets to a point where you feel either your own safety or the safety of others an issue, again, ask for that provisional ballot, check the time, make sure that you're there accordingly, and try to vote as best as you can.
All right, ABC News legal contributor Brian Buckmeyer, thank you. Meanwhile, polls are open across the key battleground state of Pennsylvania, where 19 electoral votes could decide the outcome of this election. Pennsylvania has also been the focal point of lawsuits and threats to elections officials. Josh Einiger of our ABC station in New York City joins us now from Battleground, Philadelphia. Josh, there's been a lot of focus on Pennsylvania this year. Do you get the sense that voters feel that? Do they have this increased sense of responsibility given how key that state could be to this election?
Absolutely, Diane. You know, we're here in Philadelphia, which is, of course, a Democratic stronghold. 81% of Philadelphians voted for Joe Biden 4 years ago. People here, I think, who are Democrats and engaged feel a very strong sense of obligation to carry the state because no Democrat can win Pennsylvania without Philadelphia because there are so many people who live here. 4 years ago, of course, it took days, as you've been reporting, for Pennsylvania to reach its outcome, and it was mostly because of mail-in ballots in Philadelphia County that can't be actually opened and counted until the polls close on Election Day. So people here, I think, really do feel a sense of responsibility to kick into action yet again this time, and hopefully even sooner, to avoid the uncertainty that America faced 4 years ago.
All right, Josh Einiger, thank you. And thank you for watching. I am Diane Macedo. The news never stops, and neither do we. Polls are open on this election day with millions of people set to cast their ballot. More special coverage on those elections after the break.
What does it take to be the... Disney Plus.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, the final votes in this historic election are being cast today. More than 82 million voters already cast their ballots early. Former President Trump spoke to supporters at his final campaign rally in battleground Michigan, while Vice President Harris wrapped her campaign in must-win Pennsylvania. She'll be watching the results roll in tonight at her alma mater, Howard University in Washington, while Trump is set to watch at the Palm Beach Convention Center in his home state of Florida. ABC's Alex Brachet joins me from the White House, along with ABC's Jay O'Brien in West Palm Beach for more. Alex Harris went on a local Atlanta-based radio show this morning with a largely black audience, and she seemed to dodge discussing the significance of her candidacy and presidency should she be elected. What are you hearing about her confidence going into this election day?
Well, the campaign is very confident, but I will say, I mean, we heard her campaign her campaign spokesperson earlier today on one of the cables talking about how they've never seen a race this close. Now, they're still projecting confidence, but you mentioned that interview that she had with the DJ Big Tigger on V103 there in Atlanta, as I try to dodge these yellow jackets out here. And he asked her about the significance of this, and she said, quote, "Honestly, I've just been focused on the task in front of me." And frankly, you know, that's something that I think she's identified and her campaign has identified as a winning message within, you know, the group of supporters that she is trying to attract and really kind of hold on to. Certainly within the black community. I mean, she's going to be at Howard later this evening watching these results come in. You know, that is something that's going to resonate with them. But, you know, this is about very much casting a wide net, and certainly, you know, her the symbolism of how historic this election could be is something that her opponent has hit her over, right? It's been something that's galvanized folks from the other side, and so it didn't necessarily surprise me that it's something that she kind of danced around today. I'm sure that she's very aware, but right now, these last few hours leading up to whenever polls close, it is about being as inclusive and broadening the tent and really, really trying to give any potential Harris supporter a reason to go out and cast their ballot in her favor.
Jay, what are you hearing from the Trump campaign about how he's feeling going into Election Day?
Well, publicly, they are projecting this optimism, Diane. They particularly pointed to
early voting numbers in key states where, in comparison to 2020, Republicans appear to have an edge in the early vote. What Democrats have said hitting back at that is, firstly, that 2020 was just an off election. It was in the middle of a pandemic. So many Americans were voting early because it was at the height of COVID. And so Democrats don't take much stock in that. Republicans feel confident at those. But privately, I've heard from Republicans who say, look, they are laser focused on Pennsylvania in particular, and there is a concern about possible strength in that state in the suburbs for Kamala Harris, particularly from suburban women who are going to be casting their ballots. The Harris campaign calculus goes for Kamala Harris because of reproductive rights. That is something that I've heard from Republicans who say they have their eyes keenly trained on. Early in the night and onwards as the night goes on, what do those Pennsylvania suburbs look like? There are other states where Republicans have their eye on, particularly the Sun Belt. They expect Donald Trump to do well in those states. They want Donald Trump to make gains in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, too. But if you ask them where they're really laser focused all night long, it's going to be on those Pennsylvania suburbs, particularly in those key counties around Philadelphia, Diane.
Alex, President Biden and the First Lady are spending election night watching the results in the White House residence. How significant is it that they're sort of laying low tonight?
Well, the president has been key in saying that Vice President Harris, if elected, will chart a path of her own, will be her own president, if you will. But it doesn't surprise me, and I wouldn't read too much into it that they're not at Howard University tonight. I mean, I think there's an understanding that if things go in Harris's favor, that this is kind of her moment, and so trying, this could be the president really kind of trying to step aside and let her take that stage. We saw that also last week, Tuesday, whenever she had that huge rally on the Ellipse in front of more than 40,000 people. The president really tried to allow her to have that moment, and so this is probably more of that.
Jay, control of Congress is also up for grabs in today's elections. Democrats need to flip 4 seats to take control of the House. Republicans need to flip 2 seats to control the Senate, or just 1 if former President Trump wins the White House. How much will the results of those down-ballot races impact the job ahead for whoever wins the presidency?
It will make it incredibly challenging pretty much no matter what, because if there is that divided control of government, meaning Republicans, for instance, in the Senate, as they are on track, trending to do, Democrats potentially in control of the House, although it is narrower there, their potential chances than Republicans to take the Senate. Whoever is in the White House, you got to get your agenda through a divided government. And in whatever the case may be, if it is that scenario that I just laid out, at least one chamber that isn't in control of your party. The races to watch, though, to be very clear about how this would play out, are keep an eye on Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is up for re-election. That is a state that's going to go heavily for Donald Trump. So will there be these split ticket voters who maybe cast a ballot for Donald Trump but not for and one for Sherrod Brown? Same in Montana when it comes to John Tester, Democrat up for re-election there. For those House races, they're across the map, but keep a close eye on New York. There are close House races in New York where tens of millions of dollars have been spent to unseat some incumbent Republicans there. Same goes in a way for California as well. Keep an eye on those cluster of House races in California. And then there are others that dot the map as well. But it's going to be an interesting dynamic tonight because Republicans feel very good about their chances of taking the Senate because of that map I just laid out. Democrats feel good about their chances of taking the House. And whoever gets into the White House, if both of those remain true, is going to be disappointed in one shape or form or function with one of the various houses of Congress.
All right, ABC's Alex Prochet, Jay O'Brien, thank you both. And let's bring in Democrat and former Homeland Security official Marsha Espinosa and Republican strategist Samantha Dravis for more. Thank you both for coming on. Marsha, Vice President Harris didn't respond to a question last night about whether she's confident she'll win, but she has said she's confident in the last few days. So what is her biggest vulnerability going into this final day of voting?
Well, the campaign has always said that this is going to be a razor-thin race. I mean, it's just so close. Someone on the campaign the other day said that they were nauseously optimistic, which is a phrase I have been stealing since then. But I think that, we're going to watch the numbers come in slowly, some tonight, some tomorrow, and then some maybe not for a few days. But coming from my DHS days, I think that the number one concern that we'd be thinking about is voter disinformation. Saw the CISA director yesterday talk to reporters about the number of disinformation campaigns that they are seeing, and to look to your local election officials for the most accurate information. CISA also has accurate information on their website. But I think that the campaigns, the Harris campaign is probably expecting Donald Trump to declare himself the winner tonight, even before all the votes are coming in. So it's really important to look to the experts before all the votes are counted and to not fall for that disinformation.
Samantha, same question to you. What's the biggest area of concern for former President Trump and his campaign?
Well, I think the Trump campaign right now is feeling very confident, and rightly so. The early voting numbers look incredibly strong for Republicans. They have overperformed both mail-in and early voting. Kamala Harris and her campaign, you heard Jim Messina say yesterday, the early vote numbers look very scary for her, and they do. They've missed their mark in the must-win state of Pennsylvania by over 550 ballots. So the biggest thing Republicans need to do today is turn out and vote and continue to drive up those numbers. But I think the Trump campaign feels very confident right now.
Marcia, both campaigns are trying to overcome a gender gap in the polls. How concerning is it for Harris that Trump appears to be appealing more to men?
Well, it's something that they've obviously, taken a look at, because Harris did do a bunch of podcasts and interviews geared towards men. They've come out with ads as well. So I think that they are leaving no stone unturned. Women, men, every undecided voter, they're really going after and asking for their vote. What we saw last night was Harris continuing that message of optimism and ask Americans for their vote and talk about what she's going to do for us, compared to Donald Trump, who just aired a bunch of grievances, meandered. The other day, we actually saw him pretend to perform a sex act on a microphone. I mean, this is a former president. Unfortunately, when I was watching that clip, my 17-year-old stepdaughter was looking over my shoulder, and we had to explain, the situation. This is just disgusting. It's a man who is obviously unwell. Last night, he was just totally focused on infighting, creating division, still talking about violence, fear tactics. So I think that when Americans go to the polls today, they're going to be thinking about, do I really want to go back to that? Or are we going to turn the page and, like Harris said, make way for a new generation of leadership?
Samantha, meanwhile, Megyn Kelly was out campaigning for Trump last night. She said he will protect women. How far do you think that will go in his efforts to win over women voters?
Well, I will say, I think that, a lot is being made of Kamala Harris leading with the women vote, but this election is going to be about policy, not gender. Women are not a monolith. They don't all vote the same. If you look at the polling, it shows that a third of what female voters consider household expenses and the economy and inflation to be their number one issue, and that's the issue that they're voting on. You've got 60% of the country saying that they believe we're on the wrong track. Donald Trump's closing message is simply this: to ask Americans, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Kamala Harris, on the other hand, has failed to articulate a closing message. She was asked, would she do anything differently over the last 4 years? And she said, nothing comes to mind. That's not a very persuasive closing argument when you have 60% of voters thinking that we're on the wrong track. In terms of what Marcia said about Republicans being the party of grievance, again, I hear Republicans talking about policies that work for the middle class, policies that work for women, Americans of all races and backgrounds. And what I hear from Democrats is quite a lot of grievance about how Donald Trump is bad and he's all kinds of names in the book. So I think this election is going to be about policy, and I think Donald Trump is going to be victorious tonight.
All right, Samantha Dravis, Marcia Espinosa, thank you both. And voters are casting their ballots across Georgia today. That battleground state and its 16 electoral college votes are a huge prize this election. Trump won the state in 2016, but in 2020, Georgia flipped blue for Joe Biden for the first time since 1992. Our Faith Abube's in Atlanta with more on that. Faith, what are you hearing from voters there today?
Well, voters here today have been telling me how they're concerned with the economy. They are concerned with immigration. And so that is what is bringing them to the polls this morning. Of course, split on where they stand in terms of which candidate they're voting for. Here in Fulton County, which is the most populous state in the entire state, the populous county in the entire state, we've seen a trickle of voters at this polling location. In fact, the most number of voters we've seen so far this morning was when a van came by and dropped a group of senior citizens off to allow them a chance to vote this morning as well. So it's been smooth so far. What I found interesting is one of the top officials in the Secretary of State's office put it this way. He says a friend of his went to the polls this morning in Georgia. It took him about 4 minutes to vote, and that was actually shorter than the line at Chick-fil-A. So it was very satisfying for them to actually be able to get through the line quickly, and that is what we've been hearing and what we've been seeing. In fact, the Secretary of State's office also saying that it's taking about 36 seconds on average for people to check in to get to their ballots and start casting their ballots. So this is good so far for Georgia, considering all the issues we saw here in the state. There are nonprofit organizations that are set up in certain neighborhoods. For example, this neighborhood where we are, you can see over there across the street from the polling location, there's sort of a party that has been set up. They're here specifically to answer voter questions. There are voters who are coming in here who either are lost, they don't know which precincts to go to, they have questions about the ballots, who's on the ballots. And so these nonprofits, these volunteers are here trying to answer their questions. And hopefully all of that will go well today. Officials are hoping that the numbers will start coming in around 8 o'clock, an hour after the polls close based on state law. And after that, they're hoping that this is not a long night at all, unlike the last time when it took about 5 days.
These are the kind of metrics we need on Election Day, Faith. Meanwhile, Faith, a source familiar with election threats tells ABC News that they're seeing extreme threats to black women voters in Georgia and Ohio. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so these are people who are calling into hotlines who are reporting that they feel some sort of threats, right? And this is not unusual in terms of what officials have been expecting. In fact, security has been one of the big things that officials have been hammering home. They say that they've been talking about this for a long time now. In fact, the Secretary of State's office here in Georgia saying that they've had multiple meetings with law enforcement. Their federal partners from the FBI all the way down to local law enforcement. They've already also invested in technology that allows the local election managers to actually just push a button and text not only local law enforcement, but other state officials as well, so they can respond quickly to threats. And so this is not something unusual. Of course, it's disappointing that people are being discouraged to vote, but officials are reassuring people if they have any questions, they can call their local election office. They should not be intimidated to cast their ballots today. Diane.
All right, ABC's Faith Abube in Battleground, Georgia for us. Thanks, Faith. And voters across the country are already casting their ballots this morning, but some states will be more consequential than others in determining who actually wins the White House. Let's bring in ABC News Deputy Political Director Avery Harper now for more on the candidates' path to victory. I love this part where we get to see the different possibilities that stand before them. So, Avery, what is the most likely path to victory for former President Trump?
Right, it's like a puzzle piece,
It
like
does look
trying
good, yeah.
to see what exactly could happen. We know there are 93 electoral votes that are up for grabs in 7 battleground states. And so when I look at the path for former President Trump, I'm looking at the Sun Belt. I'm thinking about places like Arizona and Nevada as being places where he could potentially be very strong. North Carolina, we know, is a place where he has a possibility to perform very well in North Carolina. Out of the last 12 presidential elections, it's only gone blue once. And so I know that's a place where the Trump campaign is hoping that he's able to come out on top. And of course, looking at places like Georgia. Georgia went blue last time, but could very well go red this time. And so those 4 states might bring him over the top and make him able to claim victory there.
And what about Vice President Harris? What's her most likely path?
I think she has to win the blue wall. Places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those are places where she has some vulnerabilities, particularly when we talk about Michigan and we talk about the Muslim and Arab American vote. That's a place where Joe Biden won very narrowly in 2020, and so every single vote there matters.
And Avery, I'm out of time, but quickly, we keep hearing must win Pennsylvania. Can either of them win without it?
I don't think so. That could very well be the place that tips the entire election. And that's why we saw Vice President Harris spend so much time there and Trump spend time there yesterday as well.
All right. ABC News Deputy Political Director Avery Harper. Avery, thank you.
Thank you.
And we have much more Election Day coverage ahead in this consequential election. Up next, we'll talk to a presidential historian about what makes this race stand out from any other. Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, you're looking at a polling location in Brooklyn, New York. Polls here in New York are open until 9 p.m. Eastern today. And of course, it is one of the most consequential elections of our time. No matter the outcome, history will be made. Vice President Harris would be the first woman to ever serve as president, as well as the first person of Jamaican and Indian descent, while former President Trump would become only the second president in history to win another term after losing a first attempt at re-election. He would also be the first person elected president after being convicted of a felony. ABC News contributor, presidential historian Mark Updegrove joins me now for more. Mark, thanks for coming on. You know, almost every 4 years we hear this is the most important election. But talk me through this. What makes this presidential race so unique?
Well, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Diane. This is the most important election of our lifetime, and perhaps the most important election since the Civil War, because these two candidates are so markedly different in what they believe in and the vision they have for our country and for the world. I think in the case of Donald Trump, you have somebody who has consistently defied and flouted democratic norms. We saw that on January 6th in particular. He has a very different view of America's view in the world. He is not one who sees the value of our relationship with our traditional allies, particularly those that comprise NATO. He coddles dictators. He's a very different person. And there are so many things that he has done throughout the course of his political career that it would have sunk any other candidate. Kamala Harris is more traditional in nature. She has a policy and a view toward policies rather and views toward democracy that are more in keeping with the presidents that we've had throughout the course of our history. So vastly different views on the nation and the world. That's what makes this so different, Diane.
Mark, polls have showed these two neck and neck throughout the race. So what has historically decided close elections?
Well, in this case, I think it's going to come down to turnout. I mean, the polls are flawed. We saw that in 2016. There are certain things that they don't reveal. But I think in this case, it's going to come down to voter turnout, how many people show up at the polls, and what those undecided voters, those few undecided voters, how they ultimately cast their ballot. Those are the things that will decide this election. But as we saw with the polls in 2016, Diane, when so many were leaning toward Hillary Clinton, there are definite flaws there. So we'll see what happens today when the polls are this close. Those results are almost de minimis, and you have to see how the vote turns out on Election Day. We'll see throughout the course of the day what the verdict for Americans are for the next president of our country.
Mark, if Vice President Harris wins the election, she would be the first incumbent vice president to be elected since George H.W. Bush. Generally, when presidents win, their party also wins a majority in at least one House of Congress. So what are the ramifications for Vice President Harris if she wins the presidency but fails to get a majority in either the House or Senate?
You know, it doesn't happen that often. We'll go back to the vice presidency. It's it's been traditionally difficult for incumbent vice presidents to gain the presidency. Richard Nixon in 1960 was the incumbent vice president, lost narrowly to Kennedy. We had Al Gore losing narrowly, the incumbent vice president in 2000, losing narrowly to George W. Bush. As you pointed out, the last incumbent vice president to gain the presidency was George H.W. Bush. And before that, it was Martin Van Buren in 1836. So it doesn't happen that often. But you're right, Diane. Generally, when a president takes office, he has both houses of Congress and can enact a domestic agenda relatively easily. Given the divisions that we have right now, if Kamala Harris gets the presidency, but not both houses of Congress, she will have a very difficult time pushing through our agenda. We haven't seen that often in our history. Usually that president gets a mandate and has those two houses of Congress who are compliant and can help him enact his agenda. For Kamala Harris, it will be very difficult as the first female president taking the helm not to have both houses of Congress. We'll see what happens in the House and Senate races and, of course, in the presidential race, Diane.
And Mark, Trump is hoping to win non-consecutive terms. Only one president, Grover Cleveland, has ever done this. That was back in 1885, then re-elected in 1893. From a historical perspective, how significant would it be to see that again?
Well, that's significant for sure. We've seen other presidents, former presidents, run for the presidency again. Most recently, Herbert Hoover in 1940, albeit not getting the nomination of the Republican Party, but vying for the nomination. So that's not that unusual. I think what makes the Trump candidacy so unusual is what he has overcome. This would represent the greatest political comeback in American history. This is somebody who was impeached twice. This is somebody who waged January 6th and cited the violence on January 6th, somebody who was convicted, as you mentioned earlier, on 34 felony counts, continues to have this fiery rhetoric, insists that the 2020 election was his and he shouldn't have been left office. So all these things make it remarkable that he has resurged. These would have sunk any other candidate in any other time. Donald Trump is a true historic anomaly, Diane.
All right, ABC News contributor, presidential historian Mark Updegrove, thank you. Coming up, we have much more Election Day coverage ahead, including taking you behind the scenes of how we are going to break down the election results in real time. Stay with us.
You're watching America's #1 streaming news. Live reporting, breaking new exclusives. Keep streaming with ABC News Live. This morning, Election Day finally here, and GMA is right there, inside the campaigns, with all the morning's first breaking news. This morning, first on GMA.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First on this election day, as results come in, we are closely watching the 7 key battleground states. ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott is tracking it all and showing us how we will be watching as those results start coming in.
Welcome to our 2024 ABC News election headquarters. We'll have all the reporting and analysis as Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump speed toward the finish line and polls begin to close. As soon as those results become available, we'll break them all down right here in real time. Over at the big board, we'll be tracking the 7 key battleground states, the key counties and cities that will ultimately decide this election. And as that data comes in, we'll track the number of electoral college votes with the help of a 3D model like this. The magic number is 270. The first candidate to reach that electoral college number will become our next president. We'll also track results on Capitol Hill and what it all means for control of Congress. When all the counting is done, Republicans need to net 2 seats to take control of the Senate. Democrats need to net 4 seats to take control of the House. Our whole team here with all the key races and the race for the White House. It all starts right here tonight at 7 p.m.
Senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, thank you. And a big thank you to you for watching. I'm Diane Macedo. The news never stops, and neither do we. Polls are open on this election day with millions of people set to cast their ballots. We have more special coverage right after the break. Stay with us.
ABC News Live.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. It is Election Day in America. The polls are open with millions of people lining up to cast their ballots. The candidates are off the campaign trail today, anxiously awaiting those results. Former President Trump spent his final day on the trail, crisscrossing 3 critical states.
November 5th, today, will be the most important day in the history of our country.
Meanwhile, Vice President Harris went all out in battleground Pennsylvania.
My entire career has been driven by a singular purpose: to fight on behalf of the people.
It's an election like no other in history, with a change of candidate just 3 months ago. We're breaking down both candidates' paths to victory in the battleground states that will decide this election. Our special ABC News Live Election Day coverage starts right now. And the final votes in this historic election are being cast today. More than 82 million voters cast their ballots early. Former President Trump spoke to supporters at his final campaign rally in battleground Michigan, while Vice President Harris wrapped her campaign with a star-studded rally in Pennsylvania. We'll be watching the results roll in tonight, and so will the candidates, of course. Harris will be at her alma mater of Howard University in Washington, while Trump is set to watch at the Palm Beach Convention Center in his home state of Florida. ABC's Alex Brachet joins me now from the White House, along with ABC's Jay O'Brien in West Palm Beach for more. So, Jay, Trump is planning to watch the results in West Palm Beach. Who's joining him, and why did he pick this location?
Well, he's going to watch the results roll in from his Mar-a-Lago club, and then he has a watch party where he has the option to speak at the convention center here in West Palm Beach behind me. Expect the Trump family to be there. Expect that coterie of key Trump advisors to be there. We've even seen some reporting from Punchbowl that House congressional leaders are preparing to quickly go from their watch parties in their various home states here to West Palm Beach if it becomes clear tonight that Donald Trump is favored to win. Another thing to watch for, though, as these results roll in, is that Donald Trump has gotten repeated overtures and repeated advice from his advisors like Steve Bannon, not necessarily his core campaign team, but those outside further right figures, Steve Bannon chief among them, to come out and declare victory tonight regardless of what the results are. Steve Bannon said when he got out of federal prison on his first podcast, fresh out of federal prison, that he thought Donald Trump should have come out sooner on election night in 2020. 11 o'clock is what Steve Bannon said, before most of the results were even counted or tabulated, and declared victory. And he recommended that Donald Trump do something similar this year. So that's the advice that Donald Trump has been getting from fringe figures in his orbit. So keep that in mind as those results roll in tonight. And Donald Trump certainly has the option, if he wants to speak here at that watch party at the convention center this evening.
Alex, the Harris campaign chair spoke on another network this morning saying the team is, quote, feeling really good about what we're seeing, but also said, I've never seen margins this close. What are you hearing from the Harris campaign?
Yeah, so Jen O'Malley Dillon really on the cable saying that, look, they're confident about today. They feel good about the work that they put in this election cycle. But the reality is, and we've seen this reflected in the polls are incredibly close. And I think that's also probably reflected in some of their internal polling data. And so, whenever you hear someone like her say that, frankly, she's never seen an election cycle this close, it really kind of echoes what we already know. But I think one of the things that you talk to folks that work on campaigns, the easiest day for them, it's nerve-wracking, but the easiest day for them is actual election day. It's, there is no more campaigning. You have your candidate, which usually they go and they vote in person. Maybe there's a briefing after that, but after that, it's about watching these results tune in and then kind of deciding kind of where to, watching the results pour in, and then deciding where to kind of go from there. But listen, this is a day of observation for them.
Jay, in terms of their paths to victory, are there certain battlegrounds that Trump or Harris have to win, where if they don't win that one state, it's likely over for them?
For Kamala Harris, it's really what we call the blue wall: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. She needs to keep the blue wall together, really, or her path to 270 electoral votes, that key threshold that she needs to hit. They get much slimmer in some instances, depending upon the map you're looking at, they evaporate. We've seen Donald Trump and his allies feel confident about what we call the Sun Belt, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia. They feel confident about their polling there. The Harris campaign does too, because as Alex said, every single swing state polls show this razor thin. But for Donald Trump, if he holds on to that Sun Belt and then he picks up one of those blue wall states, it completely changes the calculus. One of the outliers here is North Carolina. This is the only battleground state that Donald Trump won in 2020 that he now has to defend here in 2024. We've seen North Carolina very much thrust into play in this cycle in a way that it somewhat wasn't in 2020. Trump beat Joe Biden by upwards of, if I recall correctly, 30,000 votes or so in North Carolina in 2020. I actually think it was a much bigger margin than that. Point being is, now that this race is thinner in North Carolina, the Harris campaign believes if they can make Trump just spend time and resources in that state as he has over the last few days, that's good for them. But if they can make a play for it tonight on election night, that certainly adds another quiver in their column and something that they're able to kind of pull out ahead with. But if you talk to Democrats, their biggest concern, and also sometimes the places where they feel the most optimistic, are those three blue wall states. They need Kamala Harris to hold on to them. They feel good about Michigan. They feel good about Wisconsin. They feel okay about Pennsylvania. It's razor thin in that state. That's where they're focusing a lot of their attention on, and frankly, a lot of their anxieties on at this hour.
And Alex, Harris went on an Atlanta-based radio show this morning. Georgia played a big role in the 2020 election. Biden was the first Democrat to win that state since 1992. How critical is Georgia this time around, and what does it tell you that Harris decided to do this interview today?
Well, as a Georgian, I'm going to say that Georgia's always critical. No, I'm kidding. But no, it is very critical. And certainly they're hoping to repeat what Biden did in 2020. I think that, as Jay was pointing out, North Carolina being in play, if Harris has a victory in North Carolina, and I won't call it a surprise victory, but if she has a victory there, then I think it does change the electoral math a little bit, and maybe there is a path forward where that doesn't include Georgia. But still, if she gets beats Georgia, it is significantly easier for her. And we know what's really going to turn that state for her. It's going to be the metro Atlanta area and then small pockets towards the Alabama border where Columbus, and then maybe out on the eastern side near Savannah. And so whenever you see her appear on this radio show, V103, which is a flagship radio station in the metro Atlanta area, she's interviewed by legendary DJ Big Tigger. You know, this is an opportunity for her to have one last appeal in that area to really kind of drive out this excitement that, you know, she's really hoping will be the boon for her coming into Election Day.
All right, ABC's Alex Prochet, Jay O'Brien, thank you both. And North Carolina and its 16 electoral college votes is one of a handful of states that could be the deciding factor in this election. Michigan and Pennsylvania, with their combined 34 electoral votes, also critical states to watch tonight. So let's go to host and producer of the 538 Politics podcast, Galen Druk, for a little bit more on these pathways to victory. Galen, thanks as always for being on. Walk me through this path for Harris and Trump and the different options in front of them to make it to the White House.
Yeah, so the absolute sort of worst that Harris could do and still win this election is lose the Sun Belt, lose all across the South, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, but still carry the Rust Belt, or the so-called blue wall, which is Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which gets her to a 269-269 tie, but then that one extra electoral vote from Nebraska's 2nd district would put her at 270. So that is sort of the worst that Harris could do and still win. For Trump, his task is likely to win those southern battleground states that I just mentioned, but then just pull off one of those blue wall states. Right now, it looks like the closest is Pennsylvania, but I should say that over the past 2 election cycles, we've seen significant polling error in those upper battleground states. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. We saw it somewhere in the range of 8 or 9 point polling error in Wisconsin in 2020. So if the polls are off again and Trump is able to sort of sweep the Sun Belt and then pull off a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, technically, if he were also able to get that 2nd congressional district in Nebraska, he could also get to 270. But I'll say that that looks far less likely. That's a really suburban, sort of highly educated area that used to vote Republican, but has quickly shifted towards Democrats.
So this election could also shift the balance of power in Congress, Galen. So what races should we be watching there?
Absolutely. So the House is on a knife's edge. Most of the forecasts suggest it's something like a 50-50 proposition, and it's likely that whoever wins the presidency may also win the House because fewer and fewer voters split their tickets. So in 2020, there were only 16 House districts that voted for one party for president and the other party for House. And Democrats just need to flip 4 seats in order to get there. The battleground for the House is something of a revenge of the coasts. There are a lot of competitive districts in states like New York and California. And to that point, I should say that if this race is close in the House, we may not know who wins that chamber for longer than the presidency because California counts its ballots particularly slowly. So if it does come down to California, it could be a long slog. And then, of course, in the Senate, West Virginia is extremely likely to flip to Republicans. If Trump wins, that means that they will have control of the chamber with just that one flip. If Harris wins, they'll need to flip one more, and all eyes are on Montana and Ohio for their best opportunities to flip Senate seats there. And of course, I also have to shout out Nebraska again, where there's a particularly close Senate race between a Republican and an independent. No Democrat running there.
Interesting. All right, 538's Galen Druk. And Galen, we can't let you leave without wishing you a happy birthday. The irony of how long we've been talking about this election, and I did not know Election Day is your birthday, friend.
It is truly wild, Diane, the way that the stars have aligned on November 5th. When the candidates say it's the most important day in history, I truly, truly agree.
They're talking about you, of course.
Of course.
Galen, thank you, friend. Happy birthday.
Thank you.
And more than 1 million people in the battleground state of North Carolina are expected to head to the polls today. Nearly 4.5 million people already cast their ballots in early voting. The state's still recovering, keep in mind, from Hurricane Helene, and election officials say they're having to make extra efforts to make sure the election runs smoothly there. WTVD reporter Jamise Priest joins me now from Raleigh. Jamise, Jamise, how has Hurricane Helene impacted voting there?
Good morning, Diane. That was a major concern initially for those voters who lived in those 13 counties impacted by Helene. Will I have the opportunity to vote? Can I get an absentee ballot? I can tell you that the State Board of Election, they really worked for days following Helene to make sure those parameters were in place so those who wanted to vote by absentee or vote in person would have the opportunity to do so. And just looking at the early voting numbers, you can see in Asheville, well, the county where Asheville sits, about 53% of registered voters, those who are eligible to vote, voted early. So that shows there was an increase in people who wanted to vote were able to do so.
Now, most polls show former President Trump with a slight lead over Vice President Harris there. What are you hearing from voters today?
On the ground here in North Carolina, I've spent several months really talking to those voters, a lot of them undecided, but a big factor for them driving them to the polls really is the economy. That has been a big ticket issue for several people here on the ground. Will I have enough money to buy groceries? And I just spoke with a woman not too long ago, yesterday, election eve, and that was a major concern for her, a mom of 3 boys. And also on election eve, former President Donald Trump delivered that message to voters here in North Carolina, painting himself as a fixer. I am the person that can fix inflation. I'm the person that can fix this economy. And if you are an undecided voter and the economy is the issue that is your driving point, that certainly could have made a difference for them a day ahead of election. Diane?
All right, Jamise Price, we appreciate it, Jamise. Thank you. And for more insight, let's bring in ABC News senior national correspondent and ABC News Live co-anchor, Terry Moran. Terry, I know you're digging deep into these numbers. We just heard Galen go through some of them. So let's pull on that a little bit more. What are you watching for today as these vote tallies start coming in?
Well, I think one of the things you have to look at primarily is, does Donald Trump increase his vote? In other words, does his movement, this populist movement that he ignited, does it grow? He got more votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. Is he going to continue on the path? And it does look like he has made inroads with voters, young men in particular, and Latino voters, and some black men as well. If it looks like he's going to go north of 80 million, it's going to be very, very hard for the Democrats to counter that. He did something that really changed American politics, and he's still doing it. That's what I'm going to look at.
We're looking at history made either way here. If Harris wins, she'll be the first woman president, the first Asian American, and first black woman to win the presidency. If Trump wins, he will join Grover Cleveland as only the second president to serve non-consecutive terms. How do you see this country changing after this election?
Well, the stakes are very, very high because, you know, with all respect to Grover Cleveland, Trump's done something far more exceptional with absolutely no political experience. He ran for office and ignited this movement, and it carried him to the White House. He missed re-election by a whisker. Here he is back again for the 3rd time, and he could win the White House again. It would embed that movement, the Trumpist populist movement, in the government and in our politics. It would change the nature in many ways, in a very deep way, of the American